My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and continuing my Silmarillion Synopsis series, today I'm going to be covering the Valaquenta, which basically is kind of our introduction to the Valar and the major important Maiar in the world of Middle-earth for purposes of the telling of the Silmarillion story. There are many Maiar, there are several Valar. We get the names of all of them. Most of the Maiar we never encounter, so we really only get information about the big names that we're going to run into. But this chapter in the Silmarillion tells us a little bit about each of these major players. So this is our introduction to really the first beings to inhabit the world of Arda, or what we know as Middle Earth is just part of the world of Arda. So this is where we get to learn about all of them. And we've already been introduced to them a little bit. We heard a little bit about Melkor, Manwë, and Ulmo in the first section, which is the Ainulindale, which I've already covered. And I'm not gonna link to previous videos in this series. I'm just gonna put a link as I do this series to the playlist, so you can go back and look at any of the videos in the Silmarillion Synopsis series to go check them out. So I'll link to the playlist, and you'll see the Ainulindale there. But now we're going to really get some more detail about these characters and a lot more of those characters as well. So let's get started. Now the Valaquenta starts actually with a very brief recap of what we saw in the Ainulindale, and basically kind of retells in very brief synopsis the story of the creation of Arda, and that the Valar and some of the Ainur generally entered Middle-earth. The greatest among them became known as the Valar, which basically just translates to powers, but it also says that they are also called gods among men, and also there are lesser beings of the same order which became known as the Maiar. So it starts off telling us that there are 7 Valar and 7 Valier, which are the female, basically, versions of the Valar, because technically none of them are male or female, except insofar as their spiritual essence is kind of leans more masculine or feminine. But to the extent that they have physical form, it's only because they take it on as they enter Arda. So that's not really, they're not truly male or female in that sense. But there are 7 of each, and it tells us that Melkor is not counted among them because he turned to evil and his name is no longer spoken in Middle-earth. So we're only talking about the good guys here. There's actually a separate section at the end of the Valaquenta that talks about the enemies, and I'll, of course, get to that at the end. But it first starts off with Manwë, who, of course, we've already met in the Ainulindale, and it basically tells us that although he and Melkor were kind of brothers in the metaphorical sense, obviously, in the thought of Eru Ilúvatar, he is the dearest to Ilúvatar, being the most aware of his purposes, and that he is his chief thing is the winds, the airs, and eagles and other birds. And it also says that he is surnamed Sulimo, which is Lord of the Breath of Arda. Now you might, for those of you who are etymologically inclined, Sul is the same root, of course, in Amon Sul, which is weathertop. So there you see that connection. Sul is the idea of the wind or the breath, that type of thing. And it says also that he lives with Varda, who is the chief among the Valier, or the queens of the Valar, so to speak. And she is the Lady of the Stars. She creates the stars. She is kind of the Vala most associated with light, and it in fact tells us that the light of Ilúvatar is still in her face. It even says that she had rejected Melkor much earlier on, and for that reason Melkor hates and fears her, also because of the fact that the light of Ilúvatar is still in her face. And she is also, because of her association with light and the fact that she creates the stars, which, as we'll learn later, the elves first see, she is the most dearly beloved of all the Valar by the elves, and so they have a very special connection with her. And that's why in the Lord of the Rings we'll see that pretty much the only reference to specific Valar that we ever get is to Elbereth, which is a different name for Varda. She actually has a lot of names among the elves, which I won't get into all of them here, but that's part of the reason for that, because she has a very special place among the elves. The last thing it kind of tells us about Manwë and Varda is when together, Manwe can see farther than any other Vala. He can see through clouds to the uttermost ends of the earth, whereas Varda, when she is with Manwe, can hear the most of any of the Valar and basically hear pretty much everything that's going on. So it's really interesting how these two have a really unique kind of, I hate to use the word symbiosis because they're not really biological, but that's the same idea. So that's the chief of the Valar, and they're really kind of considered the king and queen. Manwe is, in fact, I think in the Lord of the Rings, called the Elder King, and it tells us here in the Valaquenta that his role is to be the first king of Arda, the created world. So that's kind of our introduction. We're starting at the very top, and then we get to move on to some other stuff. So let's go there. Next, we learn about Ulmo, who, of course, we also met in the Ainulindale. He is most associated with water, and he has the care of all waters, whether the oceans, the lakes, rivers, pretty much everything. And we'll learn a little bit about some of the Maiar associated with him, who also have kind of subdomains within that later. But the interesting things about Ulmo are he actually lives alone. He doesn't have a spouse in the sense that Manwe and Varda are spouses, which is a little bit unique. Most of the Valar, we learn, do have spouses in whatever sense you want to take that. Ulmo not only lives alone, he lives very much apart from the rest of the Valar after the creation of Valinor, which we'll get into more detail in the next episode of the Silmarillion Synopsis. After the creation of Valinor, even though he is most friendly with Manwe, he really doesn't mingle with the Valar much because he doesn't really stay in one place much. He tends to move around. And he also doesn't really take a physical form nearly as often as the other Valar do. He doesn't tend to stay in one place or anything like that. He cares about all of Middle-earth, and so he's a little more reluctant to stay just within the bounds of Valinor. So another thing that we learn about him is that he has these horns called the Ulumuri, which is not that significant in and of itself, except we do get a couple references later, but the idea is that anybody who hears the music of them becomes enamored of the water and just can't really forget it, and we'll see that later on in the Silmarillion, so I didn't want to pass that by. Another thing that it doesn't mention in the Valaquenta, but is mentioned in the Ainulindale, but which is a little more relevant here, is that it's said that the waters of Middle-earth, or, well, Arda, I should say, contain more than anything else kind of a remnant of the music of the Ainur, and that is a kind of associated with the idea that Ulmo is the most deeply instructed by Eru in music. So there's also that sense that he is very much more associated with music than the other Valar, and the waters are also more musical. Again, that idea comes up later on, so I wanted to mention it here, and it didn't make quite as much sense to just have an aside in the Ainulindale. The only other major thing here that we want to touch on is the fact that Ulmo very much is a friend to men and elves, and that will become very important later on, so I definitely want to mention that here. Now we can move on to Aule and Yavanna. Aule's domain is basically the stuff that makes up Arda. I mean, he's basically associated with mountains, gems, metal ores, that sort of thing, and he's a craftsman and a smith. He's very much a maker, a person who enjoys making for its own sake, and it even tells us that in that way he is kind of most like Melkor of the other Valar, because Melkor also desires to make things and that sort of thing, but Melkor kind of turned his to evil because of his envy, whereas Aule was more, he stayed on the right path, basically. So in the making of Arda, and we'll get to this again later in the next section, in the next video, I should say, he's constantly doing all the making, and then Melkor just comes along and messes it up, and he has to fix it, and Melkor messes it up again. It just keeps going like that. But Aule is, he enjoys the making of things, and it also tells us here, which, again, it's kind of presaging things, he is the most associated with the Noldorin elves, because they learn to love, they love to learn of him, craftsmanship, and that sort of thing. That's their kind of interest, and so they tend to be associated with Aule, who was very much their friend, compared to the other elves that we will end up learning about. If you don't know what Noldorin elves are as compared to the others, don't worry. We'll get to that later too. But let's just say for now that the Noldor are the primary elves that we're going to deal with throughout the Silmarillion, and you'll understand the importance of that later. Now, Aule is, again, spouse, using the term loosely, the spouse of Yavanna, who is the Vala most associated with plants and living things. And she is very much into things that grow. She ends up being the one that creates the 2 trees of Valinor, which become crucially important to basically the entire Silmarillion story. She, in this way, has a lot to do with Aule, because, of course, Aule is associated with the earth, and pretty much everything that Yavanna loves is growing out of the earth. And so in that sense, they have a lot of togetherness. They're very suited for each other in that way, but they do have, they're not always totally in line, which we'll see in a later chapter. But interestingly enough, in the Valaquenta, it doesn't really emphasize their, togetherness so much, but it mentions the fact that the roots of the trees are in Ulmo, water, and that their tops are kind of in Manwë's realm, in the wind. It's really interesting because it's showing us her relationship to other Valar who she's not, as closely tied to. So maybe that's a little hint at that little discord that we'll get to in a later chapter. But for now, let's move on to the next set. Now we actually get another pair of brothers. We get Mondos and Lorien, which by their proper names are Namo and Irmo. We learn that Mondos and Lorien are actually the names of the realms within Valinor that they kind of live in. They're the halls of Mondos and the gardens of Lorien, but they become so associated with their particular areas that they kind of just take on their names as opposed to their original names, Namo and Irmo. They're called together the Feonturi, the Masters of Spirits, and you can see this in kind of what their respective realms are. Mondos is basically the halls of the dead. It's where dead spirits go to await whatever judgment or fate awaits them. And in that sense, Mondos is a little bit like kind of a Greek Hades, but he's really not the same thing. So it's not really quite the parallel you want to draw. The other interesting thing about Mondos, he's called the Doomsman of the Valar. Now, what that means is not that he's doom and gloomy or anything like that. It's the old idea of a doom, meaning fate or something that is decreed or something like that. And it tells us specifically that he decrees his dooms only at the bidding of Manwë. So we get the idea that doom in this particular sense really does mean just kind of decree. And we'll see that a few times in the story, that he will speak dooms. It also tells us that he knows everything that will be except what is still within the freedom of Iluvatar, and he also never forgets anything. So of all the Valar, he kind of knows the most. And then he is wedded to Vaire, who is another of the Valier, who is kind of the weaver, and she is constantly weaving tapestries for the halls of Mondos, which are ever getting bigger because more people are dying all the time, I would assume. So they live together in Mondos, and he rarely leaves Mondos except to come to major councils and that sort of thing. And then we get to Lorien, or Irmo. He is the lord of kind of dreams as opposed to the dead. And so that's the sense in which he is also a master of spirits. And what we learn of Lorien, the gardens where he lives, is that they are the most kind of refreshing place. They are a place of healing and basically rest. And by the way, when I say that he is master of dreams, I mean also dreams and visions, that kind of dream. So he lives in Lorien, which a lot of the Valar, it tells us, will go to find refreshment whenever they feel like they need it. And he is wedded to Este, who is a healer of hurts and weariness. So obviously they kind of go together very well. And you can see the connection there. Though Mondos and Lorien are different in terms of in what sense they deal with spirits, they're very much about Mondos being about the spirits of the dead, Lorien being about, healing the spirit in that sort of sense, and Este going right along with that same idea. So that's the Feonturi and their wives. Now let's move on again. Now we come to Nienna, who, like Ulmo, dwells alone, but she does live in Valinor. It tells us that she lives near to Mondos, where she goes often, and she is associated with mourning, pity, and these sorts of things. And it tells us that her part in the music was very early on a source of a lot of the, not sadness in terms of causing bad things to happen, but sadness in the healing sort of way that became part of Arda, basically because she mourned for the discord that Melkor created. And what we learn is that she goes to the halls of Mondos partially for the help of those who are in Mondos, because they get strength from her. She also, it says that others who spend time with her learn pity and endurance and that sort of thing. So she's very much associated with kind of resilience in the face of hard things, but also pity and just compassion in the general sense. So she is kind of I'm not really sure exactly how to say this. She's the one that you go to if you have a problem, I guess. And she is also, it says, the sister of Mondos and Lorien, which is interesting because that also does kind of fit with that same theme. Next we come to Tulkas, who is called the Valiant, and he basically is a wrestler. I mean, that's really the only way to put it. He is first and foremost a fighter. It tells us that he has ruddy skin and blonde hair. He's really, oddly enough, the only one of the Valar that we get this much physical description of, besides Melkor, because we find out later that he ends up being all black, but that's a different story. But it's interesting because it gives us a physical description of him, which is unusual, but it makes sense because it really is his nature. He is a physical thing. I mean, he's a wrestler. He likes fighting, but he's not an angry person per se. He he laughs even as he's fighting, it tells us. And it also tells us that he is, though he is of no avail as a counselor, which is a nice way of saying it, he is a hearty friend. Basically, he sticks by you, even if he's not necessarily the best person to go to for advice. He basically, it tells us, lives in the present, doesn't really worry too much about the past or the future. And his weapons are his hands. He doesn't use weapons. He's just going to grapple you. That's all he needs. He doesn't need anything but his hands. And his wife, which is Nessa, or who is the sister of Orome, who comes next, fits pretty well with him. She is a very fast runner. She loves the deer. It doesn't tell us a whole lot beyond that. I mean, that's pretty much it. We're getting kind of to the lower tier here, so we get less information. But she loves deer, she loves to run, and she loves to dance. That's really the main things we learn about her. Now we can finally get to Orome and his spouse, and then we get to move on to the Maiar after that. Orome we get compared to Tulkas in the sense that he is also something of a fighter, but he's also a hunter. And it tells us that unlike Tulkas, who is kind of always laughing, Orome is a little more wrathful. Whenever he gets goaded into a fight, he's not a happy camper. And significantly, he's also a hunter, and it tells us he has a horse named Nahar, which is interesting. Why would a Vala need a horse? But there you go. And he has his own horn, the Valaroma, which he sounds often as he goes to Middle-earth. It tells us that he loved the lands of Middle-earth and was the last really to leave, and he goes back often, which will become significant later, because he likes to ride out into the lands of Middle-earth. He enjoys forests, and he also likes to chase Melkor's monsters and demons and make them go back into hiding whenever he gets a good opportunity. So he's very much a warrior type in the same way that Tulkas is, but takes a slightly different approach. And Orome is married to Vana, who is the younger sister of Yavanna, and she's called the Ever Young. And really, we don't learn much about her beyond that, other than flowers spring up wherever she dances. So you get the idea that she also is associated with plants, but more specifically flowers, which kind of makes sense as a ever young type of thing, because unlike trees, which get bigger and older, Flowers fade away every year, but they come back. So it makes sense that flowers would be associated with her. That's the Valar. Now we get to talk about the Maiar. Of the Maiar, we learn that the chief among them are Ilmare, who is the handmaiden of Varda, and Eonwe, who is the herald and banner bearer of Manwe, and whose might in arms is greater than anyone else in Arda. But we don't really hardly encounter these two very much, so we don't learn much else about them. The two that we learn a little bit more about are Osse and Uinen, who are Maiar associated with Ulmo because they are associated with waters. Osse specifically is associated with the waters that wash up on the shores of Arda, and he delights in Manwe's winds because he delights in storms. He's a bit of a violent personality, and we even learn that he was kind of enticed by Melkor to rebel against Ulmo, but he eventually repented and came back. And so you get the idea, he's not necessarily the best character. Uinen, on the other hand, is a bit of a restraining influence on Osse, and we learn that she is the lady of the seas and all the waters that lie under the sky, and that she loves salt streams and the creatures that grow in the sea, and that she is much more she is more friendly to mariners, let's just put it that way. We also learn about Melian, who will become a key character in the Silmarillion stories. It says that she served Vana and Este, and that she lived for a good while in the gardens of Lorien, and that nightingales follow wherever she goes. And it also tells us that her songs were listened to by all the Valar because they were among the most beautiful of any of the Ainur who entered Arda. And then the last Maiar we learn about is Olorin, who is said to be the wisest of the Maiar, who also spent some time in Lorien, but also with Nienna, of whom he learned patience. Is it patience? Now the interesting thing about that, of course, is if you remember your stuff from the Lord of the Rings and pay attention to detail, or if you just happen to know a lot of trivia, Olorin is Gandalf. I'll just spill the beans here. He won't really pop up again for a long time until we get near the end of the Silmarillion, but it's worth noting. Now let's talk about the enemies. First among the enemies, of course, is Melkor, who it tells us desired the light, but because he couldn't have it, eventually became envious and corrupted and fell into darkness, became just violent, tyrannous, basically everything bad, a liar without shame. There's really nothing good about Melkor at this point, which, we'll get more of that in detail, of course, later on. And it also tells us that many Maiar ended up corrupting to his service as well, and that many of these became known as the Valaraukar, or, as more commonly known in Middle-earth, the Balrogs. So that's where those come from. Creatures of fire, much like Melkor himself, engaged in extreme heat or extreme cold, like we learned in the Ainu Lindale. The Balrogs very much are creatures of fire and shadow, appropriately enough. Then, of course, we also have Sauron, also known as Gorthaur, who it tells us originally was of the people of Aule, which makes sense given what we learn later about him, but that he also corrupted to Morgoth's side, or Melkor's side, I should say, for the time being, and that other than the fact that he for a time served another, meaning Melkor, he wasn't really any better than Melkor. He's just as evil. He's a bad, bad dude. So that's pretty much what we learn about the enemies. So those are the Valar and the Maiar, who will end up being important to the overall story in the Silmarillion. As I mentioned, of course, Olorin doesn't really pop up until much, much later, but we will get a brief reference to him, at least before the end. So, hope you enjoyed the video, hope you learned something. The main thing here really is to keep this as a reference video, because if you've not really kept up with the Silmarillion before, never read it, or just never were able to finish it, and you're not able to keep up with all the names, this is really just kind of a video to keep in mind when you're going through later stages, so that you can be like, well, wait a minute, who is that guy? You can come back to this video and relearn who all these people are if you need to. You don't necessarily need to keep them all in mind for now, but most of them will come up again later. So for now, hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please do give the video a thumbs up. Please share it around for anybody else who wants to keep up with the Silmarillion Synopsis series. And before I go, I do need to give a shout out to my most recent Patreon subscriber, Grant Bradshaw, thank you very much for your patronage. And beyond that, I will link to my Patreon link below if you want to patronize the channel as well. To keep up with the channel generally, you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore, or you can subscribe over here, and you can also check out a couple of my previous videos up here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien channel. Namaste.